7.28 is on factoring out the GCF. The GCF is the greatest common factor. So, factoring is the reverse multiplication of two polynomials. Okay, so we've already talked about multiplying polynomials together, right? So, if we were talking about multiplying, we have a couple examples here. So, if we wanted to take 5x times 3x minus 7, we would distribute our 5x to both terms and end up with 15x squared minus 35x. If we had something like x plus 6 times x minus 5, we would multiply each term in the first parenthesis by each term in the second parenthesis, and we'd end up with x squared plus x minus 30. So that's multiplying, and factoring is just undoing that. So factoring is taking something that looks like this and putting it so it looks like this. So again, 15x squared minus 35x, well, the greatest common factor, a 5 goes into it and an x goes into it. So if we factor that out, that would be our greatest common factor, and that is what we are talking about today. So again, that greatest common factor, it's the highest number and or variable that divides into each term. So if we were looking at something like 6x and 12x squared, well, 2 goes into both of them, 3 goes into both of them, but the greatest common factor would be 6, because 6 goes into 6 and into 12. And then looking at our x and our x squared, well, the greatest common factor would be x, because at least one x goes into both of them. So that's what we're looking for. And then essentially when we are factoring out the greatest common factor, we have to do that first. And once we've done that, we basically divide it out of our problem. So let's look at a couple of examples. So again, we want to factor by finding that greatest common factor. So looking at letter A, we have 4 times x cubed minus 2x squared minus 6x. Now there are a lot of different ways to do it. One way is to think about just factoring it, right? Just factoring it and seeing what we have. So we could really write 4x cubed as 2 times 2 times 3x's. And we could really write 2 times x squared as negative 2 times 2x's. And we could really write negative 6x as 2 times 3 times x. And now looking at this, it's really easy to see what terms they have in common and what terms they don't have in common, right? All of them have a 2, and all of them have at least one x. So since that's the only thing they have in common, notice how the first term and the second term still have x's, but since the third term doesn't have another x, it doesn't matter. So it has to be something that every single term has in common. So that means we can take a 2x out. So our greatest common factor, our GCF, would be 2x. And then essentially to take that out, we would divide. So we would divide and see what's left over after we take that out. Well, 4x cubed divided by 2x. Again, basically we're just dividing each time here. Or we can look at our factors. When we take 2x out, we have 2 times x left, so 2x squared. When we take 2x out of that second term, we have a negative x left. When we take 2x out of that third term, we have a negative 3 left over. So 2x times 2x squared minus x minus 3 would be our answer. So looking at letter B, it'd be a good idea to pause and see what you can find. We have 5 times x to the 5th. So again, a good idea might be to write it out like this, and then 10 we could write as 2 times 5 times x to the 3rd, and then we see what they have in common. Well, they both have a 5, and they both have 3 x's. So that means 5 and 3 x's, but remember 3 x's is really just x cubed. So 5 x cubed would be our greatest common factor. And then we would see what we have left over. When we take 5x cubed out, well, we've got x squared left over for that first term, and we just have a 2 left over for that second term. So 5x cubed times x squared plus 2 would be our final answer. Let's practice a few more. Again, really good idea to pause the video and see if this is making sense or not. Letter C, 3x squared minus 18. Well, looking at this one, I can already tell I can't take an x out because my negative 18 doesn't have any x's in there. And then looking at my coefficients, my numbers, I have a 3 and I have an 18. Well, the only thing that goes into 3 and 18 is 3. So notice how I was able to do that in my head instead of writing it out. So as you are practicing more, or if it's a problem, right, C is a little more simple. It's just got those two terms to look at. When you're practicing, if you can do that in your head, you don't need to write everything out. So our answer would be 3 times x squared minus 6. Now letter D, we have 6y to the 4th plus 3y to the 2nd. Again, maybe I can do this in my head, right? I like to take it piece by piece, greatest common factor. Looking at just my 6 and my 3, well, I know that 6 is 2 times 3, so I know that I can factor a 3 out. Looking at just my y to the 4th and my y to the 2nd, well, y to the 2nd is the lower number, so I know I can take 2 y's out. And then here's what I'd have left. So if my greatest common factor is 3y squared, I would have 6 times y to the 4th divided by 3y squared would leave me with 2, because 6 divided by 3 is just 2. Y to the 4th, take away y to the 2nd, or divide by y to the 2nd, would leave me with y to the 2nd, right? Because essentially I had 4 y's, and I divided 2 of them out, so I just have 2 of them left. And then if I take 3y squared divided by 3y squared, well, those we're just dividing by itself, so we just have 1 left over. So 3y squared times the quantity of 2y squared plus 1 would be our answer. So again, notice that I've done this a couple different ways. I've showed you when we've divided, I've showed you when you just list the factors, and then what's left over, you just, right, whatever is left over, that's just what you write in your parentheses. So there are different ways to think about it, and you just need to decide what makes sense to you. So looking at letter E, think about what makes sense to you. Does it make more sense to write it out? Does it make more sense to divide it? And maybe you want to use a combination of those two. So it really just depends. Looking at this, I'm going to go ahead and write it out. I've got f and g cubed, so that would be f times 3g's plus f to the 4th, so 4 f's and 2 g's. Okay, well, looking at this, I've got 1 f here, which means I can take out 1 f here, so my greatest common factor would be f. And then my g's, I have 3 g's and then 2 g's, which means I could take 2 g's out of both of these. So f g squared would be our greatest common factor. And when we take that out, we would have 1 g left in our first term, right, because f is gone, 2 g's are gone. And then in our second term, f is gone, 2 g's are gone. We just have f times f times f, which we can write as f cubed. So f g squared times the quantity of g plus f cubed. And that's how you factor the greatest common factor out. You just look at the terms in your problem and you figure out what, if anything, goes into both of those terms. So it's just that reverse multiplication. We're going to talk about factoring for the rest of Unit 7. So we always look for the greatest common factor first. And remember that the greatest common factor can be variables and or numbers.